What's up, everyone? This is Mike with 4 and 6 Music. What I'd like to do in today's video is I'd actually like to talk about some classical pieces that have been very influential for me, both as a musician and a music fan. And when I first started getting to classical music, it wasn't until I was about like 17 years old. Before that, I would hear classical pieces, especially for me watching movies, and for anyone watching movies, you're just going to inevitably bump into music scores that have um, orchestral compositions. So I was familiar with that at a young age, but it wasn't really something I was actively listening to. That is until I listened to the first piece I'm going to discuss in the video, and that is, I have two versions. That is the Rite of Spring by Igor Stravinsky, one of the greatest pieces in the 20th century. And so this piece was originally written as a ballet. It was premiered in 1913 in Paris, and it's a very notorious debut for a piece being played because it actually stirred up a riot amongst the audience, because you had half of the audience who were looking forward and seeing the trajectory that music was taking, and the trajectory that Igor Stravinsky was pretty much pushing towards. And then you had the other half of the audience who were more traditionalists, who didn't really see the point in going to the plateau that Stravinsky was going towards with this piece of music. This version is with the New York Philharmonic, and you have Zubin Mehta, who is conducting. And then the other version I have is with the Cleveland Orchestra, with Lauren Mazel conducting. I hope I'm saying their names correctly. It's a hit or miss as far as whether I'm saying names correctly or not. So that was the piece that really got me into classical music, because there was just so much going on with that. And I feel like every time you listen to that piece, you're latching onto something that you haven't really heard before, just because of how dense of a piece it is. And with a lot of the instruments being played on this piece, they're stretched to their limits, to the point that some of the instruments don't really sound like the instruments that they are. So, for example, in the very beginning of the piece, you hear this bassoon part, and it's played all the way in the highest register possible, to the point that when you listen to it, it's hard to even discern whether it's a bassoon or not. So Stravinsky really challenges his orchestra with this piece, and for the premiere, like I said, it ended up causing a riot. And so when they were playing this, they were playing it as a ballet. And most of the time when you see it, it's not going to be played as a ballet. It's just like an orchestral piece. And that was actually the very first classical performance I went to see. That was the New York Philharmonic playing the Rite of Spring. I can't remember who was conducting those because it was many years ago. But, I mean, that was just such an exciting performance. And, like I said, if you're not really into classical music, you don't really think it's exciting, you kind of think it's snobbish, for lack of better words, check this piece out, because the Rite of Spring is probably some of the most exciting orchestral music that you could listen to. And, for me, that was my gateway into classical music. A more modern piece, it's 20th century music. So it's not going to sound as pristine and as elegant as something like Bach or Mozart. But let's move right along to the latter, Mozart. So actually, I really like Mozart's music quite a bit. When I first heard his music, like Eine kleine Nachtmusik, the piece that most people are familiar with, dun 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 dun. Yeah, for me, I just think that piece is whatever. That for me is a throwaway piece. But Mozart's music is not throwaway for me at all. I really love his stuff, especially his operas. And for me, I picked this up when I was visiting Prague many years ago, and this is actually a version of the Marriage of Figaro, my favorite opera by Mozart, and I would say my favorite opera in general. And this is with Carl Boom conducting the opera, and Carl Boom for me is one of my favorite conductors for Mozart. And you'll see this when you get into classical music is a lot of what you're going to pick up depends on the conductor and the orchestra, or the, maybe the musical group that's playing the piece, because different conductors and different orchestras are going to have different interpretations of the piece. So for when you're getting into classical music, you're going to see that, and there are going to be certain conductors and versions of the piece that you really latch onto. And for me, with Mozart's music in general, Carl Boom is someone who I really like to listen to as far as his interpretations of Mozart go. So for me, the Marriage of Figaro, I actually got into this piece because, again, when I was about like 17 years old, I heard the Rite of Spring, and then I watched the movie Amadeus, which is basically a biopic about Mozart's life. Though, I mean, it does take liberties with Mozart's life and his, career. But that movie for me was, my gateway into Mozart's music. And when I was watching the movie, I would see the work that went into the operas that he composed, including the Marriage of Figaro. There's a pretty decent section in the movie that's dedicated to the writing and the premiere of the Marriage of Figaro. And I was watching this, I'm like, oh man, that's an opera. Excuse me, that's an opera that I would really like to check out. And so I did. I actually went to the library. I rented a video of the performance. And when I first listened to it, I was not underwhelmed. I just didn't really latch onto it as much as I thought I would from the movie. Because the movie made it sound so exciting, and if you've never watched or listened to an opera before, it's long. A lot. They're pretty much like movies from back in the day, or plays really, because back then they didn't have film, so you would go to a performance, and it would be a performance. That would be basically what was in place of a movie. That was entertainment for people. So the Marriage of Figaro was pretty much that. It was just entertainment for the audience at that time. If you're listening to it with 21st century ears, though, it's going to be a little bit different because we don't consume entertainment in that way, not as a whole anyway. So when I first listened to it, again, I was like, oh, it's okay, it's not too bad. But then I started to listen to this, it wasn't really a podcast, it was more like it was these college courses by this guy called Robert Greenberg, and he has this whole course on opera and how to listen to opera. And when I listened to that course, I really started to understand the aspects of opera and what made an opera an opera. And from that, I started to listen to multiple operas that he talked about, including the Marriage of Figaro. And once I really started to listen to it, then I was hooked. I really, really enjoyed it. And at that time I was on Long Island, because I'm from Long Island. So that's like a stone's throw away from the Metropolitan Opera in not Carnegie Hall, in the Lincoln Center. So, for me, I actually bought season tickets one season. I forgot exactly when it was. I think it was like 2011 or 2012. I bought season tickets to go to a number of operas, including Marriage of Figaro. And, for me, like I said, it's the GOAT for opera. And if you're not familiar with opera, you've never listened to opera, I would suggest starting with the Marriage of Figaro because it's very straightforward. The songs are super catchy, very memorable. They're short, they're not too long, and the way that the operas are set up for Mozart's during Mozart's time, which is a lot different than if you're listening to like a Wagner opera, which just goes on and on and on. For Mozart's operas, you pretty much have song, and then a recitative, which is pretty much when the singers are kind of saying the dialogue in like a song-like way, and then it goes into another song, and then it goes to the recitative, and then a song, and it goes pretty much back and forth between both of those recitatives and songs, like arias. Like an aria would be a song featuring a solo singer. So once you get used to the style and everything, it's really quite entertaining. And Marriage of Figaro is a funny opera as well. So not only does it have the songs, but it also has the comedy, right? And a very interesting history as far as how it was created, how it was composed, and the source material from which Mozart lifted the opera from. So that's Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, which again was very influential for me within the classical sphere, and I really dig Mozart's stuff. And we're gonna move right along to another composer, pretty different composer. This guy, I actually got into him because my ex-girlfriend at the time, many years ago, she was taking a college course on, I think it was like a music appreciation course that she had to take, and she learned about this composer called Shostakovich, and she listened to his Eighth String Quartet, which she talked to me about afterwards because she knew that I was into Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, and I was going to college for music education, so she talked to me about that. I'm like, I never heard of this before. I listened to it, and I was just so engrossed by how intense this piece of music was. And Shostakovich, for those of you guys who don't know, he was a classical composer from Russia, the Soviet Union at the time, and he was composing music for the most part under Stalin's regime. So when you listen to his music, it's, like I said, very intense, especially this piece, the Eighth String Quartet. It's a very intense piece of music. He was actually planning on that being his last piece that he was going to compose, because he was planning on offing himself after that, which I'm very happy he didn't, because he went on to compose even, I wouldn't say even better. Well, I mean, for some people might say even better pieces, but like certainly pieces that I enjoy, such as his 10th String Quartet, which I think I have over here. Yeah, right over here is 10th String Quartet, which, interestingly enough, on the third movement of this, the 10th Symphony, my bad. For the 10th Symphony, he actually lifts this motif that he uses in his 8th String Quartet. That's kind of like his signature. It's basically supposed to be his name. It's 4 notes. It's the Shostakovich motif. Let's see, because off the top of my head, it's been a while since I've talked about this, the Shostakovich motif. So the notes are, like I said, they're 4 notes, D, E, C, and then B natural. And so you hear this, da, 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 and this is something that appears in the 8th String Quartet, but it also appears in the 3rd movement of the 10th Symphony, and it was Shostakovich's trademark within some of his pieces. But like I said, his 8th String Quartet is just a super exciting piece, and he did a lot with his music as far as the restraints that he had to write under, because, like I said, he was writing music under Stalin's regime, and Stalin was notorious for jailing people and sending them over to the gulags over in Siberia for something as little as not clapping long enough, right? During one of his speeches, and that was something that a lot of people had to live under, that fear of not knowing whether they would be sent to the gulags or not, because either they did something that was seen as not being patriotic, as seen as being disrespectful towards Stalin, or seen as being anti-Soviet Union. So if you were saying anything that was derogatory or negative about the party, it would not be out of the realm of possibility that you'd be sent to the gulags. Just have a knock on your door at 1 a.m. and then have someone escort you, and you wouldn't have been seen for another 15 20 years, if you were lucky to survive some of the conditions that you would have had to have faced in the Gulag system. And so Shostakovich was writing within that sort of environment. So it's really quite remarkable the music that he was able to, conjure up within that sort of environment. And like I said, his music is super exciting. For me, I would probably say he's top as far as like my favorite composers. His stories are interesting as far as like the backgrounds stories to his pieces, specifically his symphonies. So like his 10th symphony, he wrote that after Stalin died. And then his 7th symphony, I got this. This pressing is from the Soviet Union at the time. So if you look, it's written in Russian, not English. And this is Shostakovich's 7th symphony. And his 7th symphony, he actually wrote this during World War II when the Nazis were closing in on St. Petersburg and the whole city was on lockdown. So he wrote this piece as a way to basically build up morale for the troops and for the Russian people, because morale was certainly low. People were starving because the Nazis had St. Petersburg blockaded, and so a lot of food and resources could not be brought in. So a lot people were starving to death. And when they premiered that symphony, half of the orchestra was missing because they died, or they just they were just like in such poor health. And even the people who did show up to play this piece for the first time were not in the best of health either. So so like the stories behind Shostakovich's symphonies are super interesting, and it makes him very different from someone like Mozart, because when you listen to Mozart's music, he's not very biographical in his pieces. When you listen to some of his pieces, they may sound very happy and jovial, but he would have written them possibly in like a really terrible time in his life. Whereas when you listen to someone like Shostakovich, his music pretty much reflects his mindset and what he was going through during that time, which I said is quite remarkable that he was able to accomplish that under such a regime that heavily censored its artists and the people in general. The other piece from Shostakovich that most people know of, and this is a fantastic piece. I actually got to see a performance of this from the New York Philharmonic many years ago. That would be Shostakovich's 5th Symphony. And like I said, this is the one that a lot of people usually know of when it comes to Shostakovich. It's a very famous piece of his, and this actually, the premiere of this was met with a huge standing ovation. The people, not only did the people love it, but Stalin loved it as well, because he wrote this as a way to answer the criticism that he endured for, I believe it was his fourth symphony. He wrote that it was either his 3rd or 4th symphony. He wrote that and had it premiered, and it was not looked on favorably by Stalin. And you could tell this because there was a newspaper article discussing how music should be composed and played within the guise of the Soviet Union aesthetics and what they felt represented the party best. So as an answer to that criticism, Shostakovich wrote the fifth symphony. Like I said, that's usually the piece that most people know of when it comes to Shostakovich. But I would suggest checking out a lot of all of his stuff, his symphonies, his string quartets. Those two things, I think, in particular, that will really get you into his music, and then go from there, because he's got plenty of pieces. Moving right along, we're going to talk about another Russian. I seem to really latch onto the Russians when it comes to classical music, and literature as well, on a totally separate topic. When it comes to literature, I tend to latch onto the Russians as well. When it comes to literature, just like with the classical music, I feel like a lot of the Russian stuff tends to have a lot more depth than its European counterparts. And so, for me, when I was first getting into classical music, yeah, Stravinsky was the guy who was like my gateway. The Rite of Spring was my gateway into classical music. A Russian composer, though he composed that piece in Paris, and he wrote a lot of his stuff when he was abroad and not living in Russia. But yeah, like I said, Shostakovich, totally different. He was in Russia his whole life writing music, and he was writing music under Stalin's regime, heavily censored. And then this guy, this is before Shostakovich, this is before Stravinsky. This is when Russia was pretty much trying to, Russian composers were trying to define what Russian music was, because Russia is kind of an interesting country in that it's both a part of Europe and Asia. So it has this identity that's totally different from some place like, let's say, Germany or France, which is European. And so you have this kind of like back and forth within Russia, with the arts, as far as whether they're European or whether they're Russian. And then you had people like in history within Russia, like Peter the Great, who wanted to modernize Russia and get it out of the Stone Age pretty much and make it resemble a little bit more like Europe. And so this group of composers called the Mighty Handful come along, and there's some composers within this group that are pretty well known, one of whom is Rimsky-Korsakov, who wrote a lot of influential music, including Scheherazade, which is a favorite piece of mine. But the composer I want to talk about from this group is one who's not often talked about, and that is Alexander Borodin. And Borodin was an interesting composer. He was not actually a full-time composer. He was a chemist, and his hobby was writing music. And he, again, was a part of this group that discussed what Russian music was, and they wanted to basically get away from the European tradition. Something like what Tchaikovsky would have done. So when you think of Tchaikovsky, who wrote Swan Lake and who wrote a lot of influential pieces, Nutcracker, his symphonies are fantastic, particularly his Fourth and Fifth Symphony. I love the Fifth Symphony. But he was more so writing music in the European tradition. Borodin and the Mighty Handful were not doing that. Instead, they were writing music that was based off of Russian folk songs. And so Borodin's Second Symphony, he wrote three symphonies, I believe. The Third Symphony I don't think was completed, if I'm remembering correctly, because his Third Symphony I'm not as familiar with as his first two. But his Second Symphony, for me, this is the one that I absolutely love. And this particular version of it by Yevgeny Svetlanov. I know I'm butchering his last name, but this is played by the USSR Symphony Orchestra. For Russian music, some people argue that the best interpretations are from Russian orchestras, such as the USSR Symphony Orchestra from back in the day, because USSR obviously are not around anymore. But for me, this is a great interpretation of the Second Symphony, and the thing I like about Borodin is he's not overly complicated with his music, and that was something I tended not to latch onto when it came to classical. Like one of my teachers growing up, he was a huge Mahler fan, and for me, I just thought Mahler, it was a little bit too intellectual for me, I guess, for a lack of a better words. So someone like Borodin, he was just very straightforward. Again, he lifted a lot of his material from Russian folk songs, or was inspired by Russian folk songs, because the Mighty Handful was trying to write music within a more with more Russian characteristics than someone like Tchaikovsky, who is writing music more so in the European tradition of classical music. So yeah, like I said, Borodin's symphonies are fantastic. His I picked up from a record shop, $6 I think this was, a steal, because I was looking for this for a while, and this is his complete orchestral music, including In the Steppes of Central Asia, which is a famous piece of his. And then you have the Polovtsian dances, which is from his um, his fun, unfinished opera Prince Igor, and that is just a fantastic piece. The overture for Prince Igor, though it wasn't written by Borodin, it was written by Glazunov, I think it was. He basically arranged the overture to Prince Igor and took pieces like certain arias and songs from the opera, like the melodies and all that, and combined them and put them into the overture of that opera, which for me is just, I would say, one of the most exciting pieces of classical music that you could listen to. And again, there's just something about those Russians when they write classical music that is so different from the Europeans. So for me, that was just something that I really got into as I was diving deeper into classical music and checking out different composers. The last person I'm going to talk about is more modern. This guy was composing, is actually still alive, though he's getting up there in age. He was writing music in like the I think he started his career in the 50s or the 60s, certainly the 60s, and that is Philip Glass. And his piece Einstein on the Beach, this is an opera of his, or in the loosest of terms you would call this an opera. It's not an opera like what you would listen to as far as like Mozart and Wagner goes. This is totally different from that, though it is characterized, or though it is called an opera. So when I first got into this, my guitar teacher, he was talking to me about different classical composers that I should listen to, and for whatever reason, he decided to suggest Philip Glass. I'm not sure why, because he was. This does not seem like something he would have listened to. Let's just put it that way. But for some reason, he thought this was good enough to suggest to me. So I checked it out, and I think it was the one of the knees that I checked out. The first knee. So the way that this is organized, it has these little like shorter pieces called knees that connect the longer sections of the opera, and it's a total. I mean, this is not going to be as long because this is a 4 LP set. If you get the CD version, it's a more modern recording. So this recording was from the 80s. The CD version, I think, was the 90s. I can't remember off the top of my head. But that is a more updated recording. It's not as raw as as this version. For me, it's hard for me to choose which version I like more, the CD version or the older, more raw version. I do see myself going to this quite a bit compared to the CD version. Though it does have its drawbacks, mostly because of the medium that it's recorded onto. Because when you're listening to a record, you only have so much space on a side. I think it's like probably like 25 minutes max that you're going to be getting on one side, and some of these pieces go beyond that. And so if you listen to the CD version, some of those songs, such as the opening after the first knee, Train, that's about like 20 minutes long, but on one side you have both the knee, which is the introduction of the opera, and then Train. I mean, and combined, that's way over 25 minutes, but for as far as the median goes, you can't have that length of time, like 30 plus minutes on one side of an LP. So they had to shorten the pieces in order to fit onto there. But like I said, this is usually what I'm going to. But Philip Glass for me is one of those composers where, when I'm bringing his name up with a lot of my colleagues and people I talk music with, almost no one likes that sort of music. They just, I don't know, they just don't seem to get it. It's not really something that is accessible for them, and it really is not accessible music. When I was living on Long Island many years ago, I was lucky enough to have caught the performance of this at the I think it was in Brooklyn, and I was able to see the opening night, and then one of the other nights I went twice because of how much I really love this piece. Um, I went twice, and for both of those performances, from what I saw, and granted, this especially the second time, I would not have known because I was front row, and I really could care less what the other audience members were doing. But for me, I was so engrossed in this piece, and when you see it live, it's about like the whole performance is about like 4.5, 5 hours long, and there's no breaks. Usually when you go to an opera, you're going to have an intermission where it's like 15, 20 minute break, and then you get the second half of the opera, because operas are generally long, anywhere from like 2.5 to like 4+ hours. So for this, there's no break, so you're sitting there the whole time. And for me, I made sure I was sitting there the whole time for both times I saw that, because that's not a piece that's played all that often because of how complicated it is, as far as the length goes, as far as the music goes. The music is Philip Glass's music is defined as minimalist. I know he doesn't like that categorize that category. I guess the name of that type of music. He doesn't like being lumped in with minimalist composers because he doesn't really see his music as being minimalist. But you have basically like one repeated line that occurs over and over again, and then it slowly morphs into something totally different. And the thing that's really exciting about Philip Glass's music is that it's basically going on like that for about 5, 10 minutes, and then all of a sudden it just shifts to something totally different, and then it will harp on that idea for a little while, ultimately either going back to the original idea like it does in Train, or just going forward to a totally different idea, maybe in something like what you would see in his Music in 12 Parts piece, which I was also lucky enough to have seen from back in the day. So, for me, Philip Glass's music was very influential in that he took ideas that were super catchy, because, when you listen to these pieces, it's very easy to have them stuck in your head. It's just that most people wouldn't want these pieces stuck in their head because they may think it sounds like something that someone from an insane asylum would have written. Uh, but that for me is music that I like, is the unusual music that when most people listen to it, they might think, oh man, how does anybody listen to that? I'm not always going to listen to everything that's within that category, but there are composers and bands and music within that category that I personally really latch onto because they're doing something totally different that goes against the grain, that either angers most of the audience or it like confuses them. That for me is something that is super exciting to listen to because they're doing something different from what most of the people within that community or that audience is doing. And, for me, Philip Glass was one of those composers. And so when I listened to Einstein on the Beach, that really drove it home for me as far as how I wanted to approach my own playing. So when I play music, a lot of times I will latch onto certain ideas and heavily repeat those ideas. And part of the reason why I do that is because of the influence I took from Philip Glass's music. Because again, his music is highly repetitive, but it's repeating certain ideas that are earworms, that are catchy, that are really going to get stuck in your head. And it's trying to extract the most potential from those ideas as it can possibly extract. So, for me, that was extremely influential on not only me as a musician and as a writer, but also as a guitarist. Because there are no guitars on this album. It's the group, the Philip Glass Ensemble, is like what, two keyboards? It should be two keyboards, not three. It should be two keyboards, a saxophone, flute, um, a couple of singers, and that's about it from what I can remember off the top of my head. Though I'm sure there's another instrument that I'm forgetting within the group, but it's not a huge ensemble, and there are no guitars to be found on in a Philip Glass recording, specific like Einstein on the Beach. But still, for me, I was able to take those ideas and translate it into my guitar playing. So don't think that you have to listen to guitarists to influence your guitar playing. You can take inspiration from other types of music that don't even use guitar, and again, translate what they're doing into your guitar playing. All right, guys, so I hope that was insightful for you guys. I hope that there were some composers or some pieces that you never heard of before that you are going to check out after this video. Again, if you're not familiar with any of these composers I talked about, definitely give them a whirl. Check them out and pay attention again to the conductors and the orchestras who are playing those pieces, such as like Rite of Spring and Borodin's Second Symphony and all of that, because that's going to make a difference as far as how the piece sounds. And there are going to be certain composers and composers. There's going to be certain conductors and orchestras that you really latch onto, that you'll really start to appreciate the music a bit more, because maybe you've heard certain pieces from other orchestras that you really didn't like and you didn't really latch onto, but you'll hear the same piece played and performed by another orchestra and conductor that really resonates with you. So again, check out those pieces and really pay attention to the conductor and the orchestra that are playing them. Alright, so that's it for today's video. Again, hope you guys enjoyed that. If you'd like to book lessons with me, you can fill out the booking form in the description box below, and I'll get back to you within 24 hours. So until next time, see you then. Rock and roll.